to the Restitutor Orbis channel. In our explorations, we've come across many very unique buildings across the land, whether we're in Asia, Europe, North America, South America, Australia, and many other great locations. We have buildings that defy simple explanation, unless of course you accept the explanation you're given from the mainstream and don't ask any follow-up questions, such as a great Capitol building in Utah, in the middle of really nowhere. Well, today we're going to look at some of the best examples of evidence from the Old World. And our first example is going to be Conde de Lippe Fort, or Fort of Our Lady of Grace, founded in 1763 to 1792 in the great land of Portugal. Supposedly, this particular fort was part of a defensive network of forts that was to protect Portugal from invasion, namely from Spain, and then subsequently by the forces of Napoleon during the Napoleonic conflict. And here we have our classic star fort. Now, on the channel, I've come up with an alternate name for star forts, and I'll explain that. I call them geometrically precise foundation structures. Now, it may seem like it's a complicated name, perhaps it's a little overly elaborate, but oftentimes I feel that what we see of what are called the star forts, or the starburst forts, or in this case, the star sword fort, as you could call this one, is that what we're seeing is merely the top of a very elaborate foundation structure, and we have examples of previous civilizations building on top of former civilizations. The military value of this particular structure is very questionable at best. And the reason I say that is because while so much effort has been put into establishing these elaborate fortifications according to the mainstream account, it doesn't seem to have great military value. Indeed, we're told that during the Napoleonic Wars, the French marshal that was in charge of the area had no desire to actually attack the fort. He simply bombarded it. And indeed, if you look at the surrounding terrain yourself, you'll see that bypassing the fort is not really that difficult for any military formation, at least what we're told they looked like in the early 1800s to this day. Unless, of course, you're at the National Training Center for the United States Army, and as part of the exercise directive, you have to attack the fortification because, it makes sense. We see some very elaborate architectural stylings and geometric precision, though. And oddly enough, when you look at the Wikipedia entry for this particular fortification, you will find that there is not a single image that depict this geometric precision or show you a very decent aerial photograph, giving you the idea of the wondrous splendor of how it's actually laid out. Now, I will say it would be very difficult if you were going to conduct an infantry assault or a dismounted ground assault on this fortification. But as I said, from a tactical or operational military perspective, it would be very easy to bypass, and indeed it would make the most sense to bypass, or just simply ignore it. So it makes a lot more sense that really what we're seeing is that this formation, this structure, had a much different purpose and function than what we're told. And based on the wonders and beauty that we see, looking at the precision of each layout of each aspect of this particular fort, it seems to indicate a much different purpose. Now, were these star forts or these starburst formations part of some vastly different overall apparatus that may be larger machinery that's still underground and possibly incapacitated at this time with the passage of time and previous resets? I believe those are all highly likely explanations. Now, I'm sure someone will simply say, speculation, I'm not watching anymore, and that's perfectly fine. You need to have creativity and imagination if you want to be an actual human being and go anywhere in your life, and if you opt not to, that's your decision, and I won't hold it against you, and I'm sure no one else will either. But when you look at a structure and a formation such as this, you can see that there's a lot of beauty and grandeur that went into its original design and construction. And I just find it very difficult to believe that even when we look at some of the other intricacies of the construction close up and from the ground, that someone in 1760 to 1790 would be designing such a precise formation. And of course, I always pose the question to anybody watching right now, do you think that we could actually build a structure like this today, even with all the great heavy machinery that we have? And typically the answer will be no. We cannot do this today, and there's a variety of explanations given for why we can't do this today. And the first one will be, we're simply not inclined. There's no reason to do this today. And then we have the other explanation. We have so many great safety standards. Of course, in the past, if they were neglecting safety standards, you would run out of workers and labor very quickly. But of course, we're also expected to believe that there was an infinite source of labor. On the interior, we have a wondrous layout as well that seems to indicate the grandeur of interior constructions that we've looked at in other structures across the land. But one of the reasons why I believe that this particular structure is some of the greatest Old World evidence that we have is we have clear evidence, and even the mainstream agrees, that we're building on top of previous civilizations. Now, typically what they'll tell us is that we're building on top of Roman fortifications or earlier medieval kingdom fortifications, and that Spain and Portugal had this ongoing conflict, and it only makes perfect sense. And as I said, the military value of this very well-constructed fort is dubious at best. And as I said, it would only make sense if you were at the National Training Center for the United States Army in the Mojave, California, where of course you have to attack a fortification in the middle of nowhere because it's part of the exercise control plan. I mean, the operations group commander is not going to get a good officer evaluation report unless the attack happens. When you look, though, at this fortification, you do see things that would give you the inclination that it was used for military purposes. And yet, I see a more advanced construction and more advanced material when you look at what is supposedly a trench here. Now, there isn't an account that the French actually bombarded this fort, and the only thing they managed to achieve was knocking off a chimney from this structure on top that we're told is either the governor's residence or what have you when you look at the various accounts of this structure. And I'm attempting to look at this structure with more of an objective eye, not considering the mainstream account so much, because I believe that there's a lot more in the actual history depicted in the construction. And this is a structure that you can go and visit to this day, and you can do your own analysis, and perhaps you disagree with me, and that's perfectly okay. I have no issue with people taking a different account or maybe not accepting the 5 eras theory and believing that there's some other explanation behind this. Alternate realities, overlapping realities, nice portal window there. What exactly is behind the real origin, though, with this structure? And the more of these structures that you actually get around and experience in person, which is what I greatly recommend. I mean, these videos are wonderful. It's great to see images and do analysis. But if you have the means and if you have something that's nearby, and I assure you there are old world structures nearby wherever you are in the land, go and visit them in person. Interact with them. Develop your own impressions. Walk through these grand halls. Look at these archways. Notice the quality in the construction. And then compare and contrast with all the structures that we're told are more modern. Or, in summary, anything built in 1960 or afterwards, at least according to the mainstream account. Let me know what your impressions are. Let me know how you feel when you're actually there in person. But there are other aspects of this structure that stand out, such as the way it appears in different lighting, whether it's the natural lighting of the sun during the day, or if it's lighting at night. I'm always fascinated by how the color palette varies so extravagantly, depending on what perspective we have of the structure. This is the primary image that you'll get when you look it up on Wikipedia, and as I said, they don't have any of the many aerial photographs or images that show the precision of geometric layout of what we're told is this fort. And of course, they tell us it's a fort, and they reinforce the nature that yes, this is a fort. And regardless of its dubious military value, we do see some more intricate construction here in this gateway. Now, why does this need to be so ornate if this is just simply for a military structure? You figure it would be functional. But we'll be told that, well, back in the 1700s and during those early Napoleonic days, we wanted to have beautiful artistic layouts to our gates. We needed to put a lion over it. Even this tower is very impressive, and we certainly see many other examples of these towers, and yet we oftentimes hypothesize that these are actually from some other civilization and they had some other purpose. Because there's very limited to no direct accounts of direct assaults upon these particular fortifications. So did any of these so-called star forts actually work in terms of their intended military purpose? Did they change the outcome of a campaign or a war? And the answer predominantly is no. I mean, you may as well say that the Maginot Line in World War II was actually quite effective. And indeed, there's the military maximum that fixed fortifications are merely a monument to the stupidity of humanity. But I don't simply accept that as an overall explanation. In my mind, what we're seeing here is the architectural achievements of another civilization that actually valued geometric precision, artistic beauty, and inspiration in what they yielded for their structures. And indeed, that's what you see here. Or maybe you're just going to accept that the lion's head is just to look cool and it's just to motivate the defenders of the fort. And if that's what you feel, let me know in the comments. But again, we see this, and this is not the only example. This is just one of the most striking examples we have, and I dare say this is the quintessential star fort in Portugal. But you can find star forts all across the land, and we've looked at them before, especially in the New Orleans exploration and the St. Augustine, Florida exploration. The interior, of course, we're going to be told is for religious purposes, and yet at the same time, we see the wondrous achievements of beautiful interior construction with patterns that we might not associate with the classic three main religions that we have in the land today. Well, let's move on to our next evidence, and we'll look at the Royang Hotel, built 1987 to 1992, and then the exterior was completed in the early 2010s. Now, very interesting structure in the capital of North Korea that's been looked at before. Now, we'll be told that North Korea simply wanted to replicate and exceed the great achievements of the West, or at least the West in Asia. And here we can see in this diagram the wonders of this particular structure. This unique pyramid building. Construction began in 1987, contains 3.9 million square feet of floor space. Should have opened in 89, but they had an economic disaster, and despite having 3,000 rooms and despite the entire nation being dedicated to completing this structure, they had to finish it later. We're also told that the main structure, which we're looking at in this image, was rather flimsily constructed and it didn't hold up over time. Doesn't this sound familiar? It reminds me of many of the old world buildings that we've come across on the channel before. I mean, they even said that the Iowa State Capitol was crumbling in the early 1900s. When you look at aerials, though, you can see that this is a much more complicated building than you would initially realize. And what I find interesting about it is it's a very unique design. We don't see other buildings across the land that actually resemble this building, whether it's in the foundation or whether it's in the, dare I say, almost pyramid or triangular construction. And of course, in due time, what they did was they put glass on the outside of the building after it just sat around for a couple decades, and then they put glass on the outside of it, glass clad. And the official explanation is that North Korea was simply pulled away by its aspects of grandeur, and they decided to try to tackle a project that they simply didn't have the economic capability to complete. Although, of course, we're also told that in North Korea that there are no safety standards and that people simply live and die at the will of the dear leader over there. So if that's true, and based on what we're told on the 1800s, shouldn't they have buildings like this all over the place there? Just don't ask those kind of questions, okay? We have a very good account behind this wondrous building, and we're told that in North Korea they simply wanted to replicate this particular hotel in Singapore, because at the time this was the tallest hotel in the world at 750 feet or so forth. Looks like a giant salt shaker, or maybe someone was trying to build a Dalek there. You just need to put a little bit of a Dalek helmet and a big old suction cup on it. Imagine that being the tallest hotel. Now, this is an image that was debunked by Snoops.com that shows the hotel in North Korea with a big mountain as though it was being dug out. And Snoops.com, and I'll attach a link in the description on the video, they do some very interesting circuitous logic, and they come to the conclusion that because of a file that's no longer available, this image was produced through art and digital art. Very interesting. Although there is another image that's distinctly different, and I don't know if they were talking about the same image or if they were suggesting that this other image was also produced by digital art. It's intriguing to me, though, that the good individuals at Snoops.com don't ever bother looking at the construction images of, say, the Cathedral of Learning in Pennsylvania, or many of the other structures we've looked at, such as my favorite pillar or my favorite column construction photo from the Civil Courts building in St. Louis, where that guy was holding on to the edge of the column with his foot, because why would anybody want to analyze that? I wonder if Snoops.com is closely affiliated with Brian Dunning. So we really don't have great construction images of this building, and in my humble estimation, any one of them are very questionable. And of course that can be explained because we'll say it was North Korea, it's a closed society, they don't want anybody in the West to know about their achievements or their challenges. And of course, we'll be told that the building just simply sat like this for a couple decades, which in and of itself, whether those mountain photos are true images or not, that we saw where it looked like the building was being dug out of the mountain, it is very peculiar that this structure just stood around for a couple decades. Why didn't the dear leader just simply direct everyone to drop what they were doing and finish the building? I mean, national pride was at stake here. We have even more peculiar construction photos of the very top of the building. And of course, they put a big old crane on the top of it. And yes, a very high quality image here that even though it was the 1980s and 1990s, we can explain away by saying that photography just hadn't advanced in North Korea to where we could get a very nice image that we couldn't question. And here we have the great effort where they put all the glass on the exterior of the building, making it a more modern glass-clad building. I always find that so intriguing that, modernity is reflected in the 20th and the 21st century by glass and steel. We've got a lot of glass for you. We need more glass. Now, looking at some of the images, you can try to make a bit of an assessment in terms of the interior structure or the skeleton of the building, if you will. And it's kind of hard to assess exactly what it was. Now, the reality was I wasn't actually there when it was constructed, and I don't know anybody else who was there when it was constructed, which is quite intriguing, and I don't think we're going to have anybody from North Korea who was involved in the construction get on the comments. You never know, we might. The interior images, though, of this hotel are very limited, and it's also called the Hotel of Doom, and it has many other rumors associated with it, which is no real surprise. Now, could this be an actual interior photo of the hotel? Perhaps. But then again, looking at some of the other exterior images, it's very hard to tell for sure what we're really looking at with this particular structure. I mean, we know it's there, even though the article on Snoops.com even questions if the building's there, at least the way they wrote it. It's quite intriguing when you think about it. What does seem to make sense, though, is that if this was a building which was just sitting around for decades, or who knows how long for sure, they decided to clad it in glass on the outside to give it a more modern appearance. And yet we see how our modern skyscrapers are built, and you can go back to the good old 801 Grand building in Des Moines, Iowa. Many different images, though, that seem to give conflicting accounts about this building. Now, I think it's almost as though we have an intentional deception, if you will. Perhaps I'll dare say there is some erroneous information being released about this building. It feels as though we're being misled to try to derive a true account. And indeed, when you look up other interior photos with this particular hotel, you will find, and if you do a little bit of research on your own, that they're actually the interiors of other hotels supposedly in North Korea. Although, are they? It's interesting that the digital trail of information is so obfuscated. And yet Snoops.com says that that's the grand evidence to prove that what we're told about this building, or that the mountain that the building looks like it was dug out of, was actually just composed by some artist. Now, of course, we have nobody who actually stated they did this or composed digital image manipulation to achieve this. But it's very odd. It's a series of conflicting accounts. For example, is this possibly an interior image of this hotel? Or, again, is this something else? Is this another hotel? The only way to know for sure would be to actually go to North Korea and actually go and look upon this hotel and go inside of it and ascertain if these images are in fact accurate. There's a reason why, at the end of the day, I'm the biggest fan of boots-on-the-ground exploration. But it is odd that there are all these conflicting images and all these conflicting accounts from a nation that to this day we're told is closed off to the rest of the land. And yet it paints the picture of a very impressive tower that's over 1,000 feet tall with rather unique architecture. And in my humble opinion, I would say that this building, even with its lovely modern glass cladding, does exceed that hotel in Singapore, and not just in height, but also in architectural beauty. But that's just my personal opinion. Maybe you feel differently, and that's fine. Let me know in the comments. You can see, though, that this is a very impressive landmark on the skyline of the capital of North Korea. And yet we can see the efforts that they went to. We're told that it still took a long time to actually clad the exterior of the building in glass. Now, why glass? Do you think there could be some other construction material that they could use to actually clad the building? I mean, we're told that the 801 Grand building in Des Moines, Iowa is clad in some form of granite, but it seems to change every time that you look at it. And of course, if you recall the interior exploration we did on the 801 Grand building, we found that everything on the inside of it was not quite as solid as your eyes would lead you to believe. So going back to the hotel here in North Korea, who knows what the true account is? It's quite an enigma, and I think that's why it's worthy of our attention. Now, if this is indeed a building that was founded, if you will, and then modified over time, which we can say that is exactly what happened, North Korea has shown that they do have some vagus inclinations with the way that it's lit up and used to this day. The final question I have is, why would a closed nation with a closed society want to build a magnificent hotel? Wouldn't they have a different stated purpose for the building? Oh well, no matter. Now we're going to look at corn palaces, prominent in Iowa and the Midwest in the 1800s. Yes, we go back to the 1800s when it seems anything was possible. There were no logistic limitations in the United States, and we know that there were no safety standards. Well, in Iowa, South Dakota, and a couple other Midwestern states, they decided that given the fact that they had so much time on their hands and there were no other challenges, they were going to build elaborate corn palaces. Although it should be noted that they didn't just use corn, there were accounts of using other things such as bluegrass. Yes, there's a bluegrass palace in Iowa too, not in Kentucky as one might expect. So what exactly was going on in Iowa? Well, let's just remember that Iowa was the magical land in the 1800s. I mean, they had a really sloppy capital city that they just designated in the 1850s that a teacher wrote an account about how awful it was, and they managed to transform it into a very beautiful city and build an incredible palace that they call their state capital in a limited amount of time. Well, while all that was going on and all the other courthouses that they were building across the state, and let's not forget the mental asylums that they constructed in the same time frame, they were also building corn palaces because they just had too much time on their hands. Now, this is what we would expect a corn palace to look like, and this is an alfalfa palace. Now, I could see this happening. You just throw out bales of hay, bales of alfalfa, bales of bluegrass, and you could build yourself a very impressive palace like this, and this is what we'd expect to see. But this is very much not what we see when we look at these corn palaces, these bluegrass palaces, whether we're in Sioux City, Iowa, or in the small town of Creston, Iowa, Union County, which is where the bluegrass palace was constructed. And it should be noted that Creston, down in south central Iowa, is relatively isolated, much in the same way that Cherokee, Iowa, is isolated, where we saw that other mental asylum. Very intriguing, though, that farmers and people in the 1800s in Iowa would have so much time on their hands that they would decide to build these corn palaces, these bluegrass palaces. And they're the finest. You have towers, you have turrets, you have parapets. You even have very well-designed windows with very intricate designs and construction and archway entryways. So this is not just simply a pile of hay or some other crop that somebody piled up. This looks like an actual structure. So what's really going on here? As if it's not enough, we even have portal windows on it. So did they really have all this kind of time that they could just simply do something like this? And how exactly was this done? They build a wood framework and then they just simply filled it in with whatever crop that they had, and then it held up and it stood perfectly, at least long enough to where they could get a photographer, and we're always told about how difficult photography was back in that time, to set up and actually capture images. And we see many different architectural stylings behind these corn or crop palaces or whatever you actually want to call them. It's as though they just had nothing better to do. And my other question is, why aren't we doing corn palaces like this today? We have heavy machinery. If we could do this in the 1800s, then maybe we could do an elaborate corn palace, or maybe even an imperial corn palace. And since Iowa's so great at doing these things, they could do it at the Iowa State Fair. They could build a corn, bluegrass, and alfalfa palace today that would be beyond anything you could imagine. Maybe it'd even be 10 times the size of the Iowa State Capitol. Whether you're in Sioux City or wherever you are, you can even see that the so-called corn palace matches the actual permanent buildings in terms of construction detailings. Very intriguing. So in Iowa, not only can they build impressive state capitals that rival any palace or whatever you want to call it across the land, they can build corn palaces that rival the existing buildings they have in their own town. So what are your thoughts on this very interesting phenomenon that we have in the Midwest? And why were they so elaborate and ornate, and how exactly were they achieved? Was it just the fact that everybody had that kind of architectural know-how that they could really build complex structures with any sort of material? Who needs concrete? Who needs any of that annoying granite, sandstone, or limestone? You can just use crops, and it'll stand up long enough to where you can at least snap a picture of it. Oh, and by the way, you can have multiple stories behind all these. You can build elaborate towers. You can also invite people from across the land. And honestly, this would be a great draw for tourism. Now, as we said earlier, we know that North Korea is not in tourism, but they're still going to build the greatest hotel in the land because, well, they just want to do things. But in Iowa, it'd make a lot of sense if you could build these corn palaces today, and you've got people driving through, and you could put your little signs on the interstate, so instead of people driving through I-80 or I-35 at 80 to 90 miles per hour, they'd see a sign, "Come see the greatest corn palace." Have a little picture of it. They do have really nice rest stops in Iowa, and you could direct everybody to these corn palaces. Charge a little bit of admission, set up concessions, sell those great Iowa chops. The interiors are also very unique as well, where it seems as though there's an existing interior and they've simply slapped up corn and crops all around it. So I'm really not sure. I mean, was this just an actual idea that they were trying to draw tourism when travel was much more difficult? Well, except when it came to the World's Fairs, travel was easy then. Here's another look at the so-called Bluegrass Palace in Creston, Iowa, and this is way down in Union County in south central Iowa, where there's really not any large cities even to this day, and it's relatively sparsely populated. They also have some very magnificent courthouses down in that area that we've looked at. So I guess if they could do the very magnificent courthouses, then doing a bluegrass palace, that was no trouble. I enjoy the cupola on this particular one, and it's interesting how many different variations of crop palaces that we have. And I have to ask, are these really palaces or buildings made of crops, or are they made of something else? And they were just told that they were made of crops. I'm not sure. Again, wasn't there, but it's quite an anomaly that we have. And indeed, you can see some of these corn palaces, alfalfa palaces, or bluegrass palaces match some of those wondrous courthouses that we looked at across the Midwest. So again, it's very puzzling, and it's something that you cannot simply explain. Again, unless, of course, you're going to accept whatever you're told by the mainstream account. Because why wouldn't you build a bluegrass palace like this with very impressive towers, multiple stories, and stairways leading up to the multiple stories that people could actually walk on and go all the way to the top of? Watch out for that random wind that comes up in Iowa, and oh yeah, it's also known to being hit by tornadoes, but why worry about that? How much effort went into this? And why weren't farmers more concerned about ensuring that they had the same yield of crops? Well, of course, that's when we had the magical fertilizers that were developed that magically solved all the challenges of the 1800s. So were there challenges in 1800s or were there not? Very, very interesting when you try to compare that account. I mean, clearly there were no logistical challenges. Logistics just weren't a problem in the 1800s. I'm not even sure what to make of some of these interior images of these crop palaces. I mean, are we really looking at an actual structure here that's just decorated with the crop? Because that's the impression that I get. But by all means, let me know what you think in the comments, because it's very puzzling and it's not something that you can simply explain, unless, of course, you're going to take everything you see at face value. And just an example of one of the type of buildings that we tend to have in the Midwest that we're told is made out of sandstone, limestone, or that good Anamosa limestone that you could find in Iowa that they seem to be able to get everywhere at the same time. Although Stone City is nothing left to look at. But the Anamosa prison is still standing in Iowa, so visit it at your leisure. Let's go over to what used to be the Soviet Union, look at the Cathedral of Christ, the Savior in Burki, and what is now called the nation of Ukraine. I won't put the before it. And what an impressive structure here, this very pretty and unique cathedral. Now, we're told that this was destroyed, unfortunately, during World War II. Although attempts to ascertain exactly who is responsible for it, this is an image of another cathedral, another Christ of the Savior cathedral that we're told was burned down by the Soviet regime. But going back to the one that we're actually looking at, it's very difficult to find any sort of mainstream account in terms of who's responsible for the destruction. Now, we're told that there were a number of very difficult mobile armored battles that were occurring at that time in this area of the land in the Soviet Union during World War II. Between the Wehrmacht, the defense forces of Germany, and the Red Army. And we really don't have any determination in terms of who is responsible for the destruction of this building. And of course, it's hard to say. Oddly enough, though, we don't really have many accounts of other wondrous cathedrals or churches being destroyed by either side during the Great War. There's accounts of them being damaged, or Great War is probably not the right term, but, we have so many wars, which one is it? Is it the war to end all wars, or is it the war to make the world safe for democracy? And I remember that joke about World War III. Oops. In any event, the interiors of this very impressive structure are something that we've come to expect with some of these cathedrals, and yet I've never seen a cathedral like this in all the ones that we've looked at. And so this seems to be more evidence that what we have here is a structure that simply could not be explained. And it was a structure, therefore, that could not be allowed to endure at any cost. Because if you want to say narrative buster with this particular building, this is the quintessential building for it. You have complexities of construction, you have an impressive dome, you have towers, arches, and very intricate designs inside and out that you simply can't explain. And it should be noted that this particular area that this cathedral was constructed in was very sparsely populated. So it's a similar account to some of the other wondrous churches that we see, and I'll just go back to my favorite example of Iowa, because in Dyersville we have that very large basilica in a town of a couple thousand people, and then in a township a town that's unincorporated of 75 people, they have a very large cathedral, or church as they call it, which is quite hilarious, in the unincorporated town of Petersburg, Iowa. Again, I really wonder what kind of glories were lost with this building and how exactly was it destroyed during World War II. And I was quite puzzled about the fact that I couldn't find any more specified account about how this building was destroyed. Did the Luftwaffe bomb it? Did the Red Air Force bomb it? Did somebody else bomb it? Was it caught in the middle of a ground battle? Did Manstein have some tanks run over it and after they blasted it? It's amazing some of the things that they'll tell us, even though we know that they're not exactly feasible as in terms of how they instructed us the building was actually destroyed. And yes, I say instructed very directly. But what really was lost in this structure? The exterior is extremely impressive, and again, there are very few structures I've seen that actually match its beauty and its ornate detail. And this is one of the primary clues that we have that there were other great structures in the distant past. That some of those structures did survive to reach us, but the ones that seem to have been deemed that they were a little bit too elaborate, well, they met with a very unfortunate end. Although I also have the theory that some of the structures simply cannot be torn down. Now, it may be that we lack the means, or it may be that someone knows that tearing down some of these structures may have other undesired effects, which could further destabilize a land which currently does have many destabilized effects because of past resets, or even technology that past civilizations looked into and explored that wasn't exactly stable. It's hard to say, but we have numerous indicators of this, and we're going to explore this as we go forward. Although I have to admit, there are some issues with the five eras theory. There are some issues that don't actually answer all the questions we have, and there are numerous examples, such as Art Deco, that seem to go outside the established timeline. Although I think it's important to remember is that everything that we're going off of is the same information that we're given, whether it's the actual historical chronology or what. And I'll just leave off on saying that the five eras theory is just that. It's just a theory. There could only be one era with major transitional events that occurred. Perhaps someone more influential or more capable than myself can actually solve the riddle. Well, I appreciate you joining me for this exploration, and I wish you all well.